informational video on making a conference poster for the Connecticut Conference on Natural Resources. This is Laura Cisneros from the Natural Resources Conservation Academy. And my goal for these series of videos is to help you create your own professional conference poster, as well as help break it down into easy, manageable units so that it's not so overwhelming. The conference is a fun and exciting event, and we're all looking forward to seeing you and hearing about your conservation work. Okay, we now have a rough draft of our methods, so we can move on to a different section of the poster. I typically recommend working on the introduction next, because most often we're still collecting data and can't analyze it quite yet, so can't get to the results section quite yet. So let's work on the introduction. We can edit the section again by simply clicking in the general vicinity of the section, going down to the lower right hand corner, and clicking this plus sign to zoom in. You can see that I have some recommendations for the type of formatting you might want to use in this section, as well as the type of content that typically goes into the introduction section. Again, just like the methods, you can change the header to something that is maybe more fitting for your project. Some examples are, you could call this motivation and objectives, because this is what we will be discussing in this section. We'll be discussing the reasoning why we're doing this project and the objectives of the project. Another example of what you could title it is purpose and aims, for example. But for now, we'll keep it as introduction. So just like the methods section, I recommend using either a short paragraph format and keeping this to 1 to 3 paragraphs. Avoid big, bulky paragraphs. We do not want big, bulky paragraphs. And that's because it's very difficult to read a large amount of text on posters. You could also use a bullet point format if you would like. So those are 2 suggestions as to how you could format your introduction. For now, we're going to stick to this short paragraph type of format. So we can get rid of this. Okay, so the rest of the paragraphs discuss the type of content that would go into the introduction section. You can read this at a later time, and for right now, we will use this inverted triangle to help convey the type of content that we want in this section. And you've probably seen this inverted triangle in your English classes, the dreaded inverted triangle, but it's actually really helpful for structuring an introduction paragraph when you're creating a poster, as well as when you're doing scientific writing. So this is what we're going to use to help us focus our introduction. So when you start your introduction, you typically focus on this broad overarching theme or problem that your project is associated with. So when you're trying to think, what is this broad overarching problem? First think, why should anyone care? So why should my neighbor care? Why should my mom care? You want to think of why your project, your study is so important. What is the big problem that your project is addressing? And this is something that scientists think about all the time, because we as scientists know why our study is important, but it's really important that we can communicate why our project or study is important to the public. So you want to think about why this might be important to anyone, to the public. Once you've discussed that, you can move on to a more specific issue or topic. And in this section, you might want to consider discussing what type of information or element is missing that we need to resolve these issues, which will then lead to the purpose of your project. And at the end, you'll discuss what are the objectives, goals or aims of your project, and you'll list those out. Okay, so now that we have that settled, what we will do is we're going to keep this triangle here, and we're going to try 2 examples and using this inverted triangle. So I'm going to delete this here. And everything that I'm going to write is not going to be very eloquent, but we're just going to get the ideas on the paper. And that's what I want you to focus on for your rough draft. Just get the ideas on the paper. We can worry about rewriting, refining, smoothing out the introduction later, but we don't want to get hung up on trying to write it perfectly the first time around. Okay, so let's pretend that my project is on bats, and I would like to monitor bats in my local community, as well as put on some workshops to teach my local community members why bats are important, how we can help them by building bat houses and installing them. So when I'm beginning my introduction, I want to first think, okay, why would anyone care about bats? A lot of people think bats are scary and yucky and gross. So what's going to make them care about bats and installing bat houses? So so just to save some time and not spend a lot of time typing, I did prepare a little bit of an introduction. So I could start this off by saying, well, as aerial insectivores, bats are really important. They play vital roles in both forest and agricultural systems by regulating insect populations. An average-sized bat colony is estimated to consume over 1 million insect pests per year. So, pretty important. I can then go on to talk about what is currently threatening bats. So they're so important, but today bats are facing many, many threats. They're affected by landscape modification, climate change, and also, more alarmingly, North American bats are being affected by this fungal disease, white nose syndrome, which has severely depleted many bat populations, a particular hibernating bat species. And so monitoring and conservation of these species is critical. I can then go on to talk about now what my project is doing to address these issues or help out with these issues. So I just said monitoring and conservation are critical. So my project is establishing an acoustic monitoring program for bats at X number of locations in my local community. So I live in Stores. And then I can talk about how I'm designing and implementing workshops on how to build bat houses for my local community. So that's the objective and goals of my introduction. So you can see the introduction can be fairly short. It can also be much larger than this. It's going to be dependent on your project. I also want to point out that here I did state some facts that need to be supported by sources. So for example, this sentence right here, I'm going to need a reference here, as well as in a couple other locations. So in a later video, we'll talk about how to add references and how to properly cite something within the body of the text here, as well as within the reference section. So we won't focus on that right now. So I am going to take back what I said about doing 2 examples right now, given the time, and we are going to now go look at some examples online. Again, to see past NRCA student posters, go to the nrca.uconn.edu page and then click on Past NRCA Students. It will then bring you to this page that contains a number of tables that contain our students' posters. And we're going to review a couple right now just to get an idea of how they structured their introductions. So let's take a look at this one. This student used macroinvertebrates as bioindicators to guide restoration in a watershed. And so let's see how she structured her introduction. So she starts off by saying how water is very important, but it only covers a small proportion of the earth. And of that small proportion of the earth that it covers, that fresh water, a large proportion of that fresh water is considered unhealthy for swimming, fishing, or aquatic life. So this is a serious problem, and restoration is needed. She then goes on to say how because of limited time, supplies, and funding, we need to determine which areas are most degraded and in most need of restoration. The rest of this paragraph discusses how macroinvertebrates can be used to assess water quality. She then talks about her objectives of her project. So she says her project will evaluate a biotic index of macroinvertebrates in particular zones of the Salmon Kill watershed. So this is the Salmon Kill watershed, to assess where water quality is poor and to help guide restoration need. So a very nice introduction. Let's go visit another one. Let's take a look at this one. So this student was trying to bring awareness of the type of restoration that was being done at a local Audubon center near her. They were using large woody debris. And you might think, what is large woody debris? Why is that important? Well, she explains it nicely in her introduction. So again, she goes on to discuss how many river systems are degraded and how large woody debris are being used to help improve and restore these freshwater systems. She then discusses why large woody debris are important. They're important for minimizing erosion, flood control, and habitat restoration. Then she discusses how considerable data has been collected on large woody debris, on their effects on freshwater systems, but most of this data and results are in the form of scientific reports or large PowerPoints. This is of little use to the public. So the goal of her project was to compile this data into a user-friendly format for the public. So again, another nicely written introduction. Let's visit one last one. So we'll visit this one. And I'm visiting this one because this one takes a little bit of a different approach. It's more of a research study. So this student asked, how does the distance away from trails affect bluebird nesting? And so he's looking at these bluebird boxes and how the distance of these bluebird boxes affect the likelihood that a bluebird will actually nest in it. And so I'm not going to go over his introduction like I did the other ones, but I just want to point out the last part of his. So like the other ones, he discusses the objective of his study. So he says, I will evaluate the proximity of these bluebird houses to trails and how it influences the likelihood of a bluebird nesting in it. And then at the end, he puts forth a hypothesis. So unlike the other ones, which just stated their objectives, this one actually presents a hypothesis. So he hypothesizes that the farther away a bluebird box is to a trail, the greater likelihood that a bluebird will be nesting in it. So I wanted to show you this just to show you that you can also predict what may happen, put forth a hypothesis. Okay, so I again encourage you all to look at other posters, not only in the most recent year, but the past years as well, to get ideas of how to structure the different sections of your poster. Still have more questions or need more help? As always, feel free to contact me at laura.cisneros@uconn.edu or by phone. I also recommend that you visit the NRCA website. It's filled with a lot of great information, especially the community project and past NRCA pages. Those pages have all the posters done by our past NRCA students, and you can get an idea of content to put in your posters, as well as different ways of displaying your content and information. I hope you found this informational video helpful, and we're all looking forward to seeing you and your poster at the Connecticut Conference on Natural Resources.